Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everyone here in person and online. This session now is entitled Research Dialogues, Climate Research for Policy and Practice. This event is supported by Climate Compatible Growth, CCG for short. CCG is funded by the FCDO, the UK's Foreign Commonwealth Development Office.
If you would like to ask a question throughout the event, please use Slido. The link is www.slido.com and the link is 2715656, and that information should be clearly visible to you online, and there's also banners around the room. So now I'd like to introduce you the chair of today's session, Angela Churi-Gauhalga. Angela is the Executive Vice President for the Impact of Environmental Defence Fund. Thank you.
It's on? Okay. Yeah, I think it's on. Okay. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you who are joining us, both here in Sharm el-Sheikh as well as online. We are at a critical juncture in human history, in the sense that we are being faced with multiple crises, and the threat of climate change has never been more real. The science is clear that we are not on track, and we need to do so much more. Countries in the global south, of course, face both the challenges of climate change, in addition to all the other crises, as well as they try to meet their development aspirations. And therefore, we should be looking for solutions that basically are an all-of-government or an all-of-society, based on an all-of-government or all-of-society approach, which then requires us to integrate different streams of knowledge, develop partnerships, and strengthen collaboration so that we can come up with solutions that, one, address more than one problem, two, that are well-informed, policies that are well-informed, that will then drive practices and actions that are effective, impactful, and timely. So the aim of this particular side event on climate research and policy and practice is to share experiences between organizations about their practices, to share reflections on how this could actually be strengthened. We want to understand better how you can build and co-create knowledge, nurture trust, and good working arrangements, also with the end users of research. We will also discuss ways about how different states behave and operate differently in using the contributions made by the research community. So I have with me 4 panelists, 3 who are here in the room and 1 who is online. So I will introduce them briefly, and they will have a chance to tell you a little bit more about themselves, about their work, and kickstart a conversation where we can delve into how can we maximize the potential of using research to inform policy and practice? What do we need to do? And how do we get there now that time is really running out for us to be able to undertake meaningful actions to stop climate change? So we have Lucas Somavilla-Croxato, who's with the CCG Program Partnerships at University College London. We have Lakshmi Bamidipati, who's an advisor on energy and climate at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. Lakshmi is online. Thank you, Lakshmi, for joining us. We have Rebecca Shirley. Oh, sorry, Rebecca's not here. We have Bernard Tembo from the Zambia Institute for Public Policy. And we have Beth Tennyson, who's also CCG National Partnerships. So I'm going to start with Bernard to give you have a couple of minutes to introduce yourself and help us frame this conversation from your perspective. What are the critical things we should be thinking about?
Thank you very much. Maybe before I give what I think are the critical things we should focus on, I just thought it might be a good idea to give people a quick context in which we are looking at climate action, or when we say climate change, what we really mean. So climate change in itself is broad, right? So when someone says impacts of climate change, what does it look like? If you're an energy person, You may think you're producing from coal, therefore you're impacting, you're emitting carbon, and therefore you need to mitigate the carbon. But if you're on the hydro side, you're thinking there is reduction in water, therefore I need to adapt to the reduction in water. So firstly, when we think of climate change, then we need to look at what are the basic parameters of climate change that we think of when we're advising people, when we're talking about climate, or when you're talking to politicians or policymakers or just the general public. So there's one which many people can identify with, which is temperature. Then the other one is rainfall. That's like the first level. Then how does change in water or rainfall and change in temperature impact something else? So in this case, how does it impact the biosphere or issues to do with the soil quality of a particular place or the water quality of a particular place? That's now you're thinking of level 2. Then at level 3, you're thinking when the soil quality reduces, what else reduces? So in this case, if you're from the agricultural sector, you're thinking of agricultural productivity has reduced, you're thinking of maybe water demand has increased, and issues to do with production of electricity from hydro also is affected, and the like. But what now? What happens if productivity, labor productivity, for example, reduces, or agricultural productivity reduces? What happens? Then now you go to the 4th level, where you're thinking there is poverty, because if someone plants and you cannot harvest, it means that you've lost your money. The issues to do with disease breakouts, so all sorts of things now at 4th level. But depending on the policymaker that you are speaking to, you might speak to a policymaker who is really on the high, on the downstream or on the upstream, depending on the kind of politician. And therefore, the advice that you're going to give that politician will really matter where they sit in there. For example, the health minister would be more concerned with disease breakout at the bottom. But if you are the energy minister, you're more concerned about if your system, which is, for example, like Zambia, is based on hydro, then you're more concerned to say, how do we ensure that the utility that we have or the plants that we have are financially viable when there's a drought? So it just depends on which kind of policymaker you're talking to and you're advising. So I just thought it would be nice to give that context so that people understand when we say climate. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, thank you very much. And I think it's really important that we unpack and put a face to what it is we're talking about. And I think this is why it's important to be having the conversation with folks in the research area who are able to do that and able to target the advice of policymakers. Over to you, Beth.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. So I am Beth Tennyson. I'm part of the CCG program, but I'm based at the Center for Global Equality and also the University of Cambridge. And at the Center for Global Equality, we are part of the National Partnerships team. And so I thought, before I dive into that too deeply, to give an overview of what the Center for Global Equality does outside of CCG, and then how we take that practice and put it into CCG's context. So the Center for Global Equality's kind of tagline is about inclusive innovation. And so I'd like to give an example of that outside of CCG context on what that means. So with my University of Cambridge hat on, I have solar energy expertise, and so there was a problem that's been identified in Ethiopia with smallholder farmers, and they've seen that having solar-powered water pumps could be a solution to enhance their crops as they face some issues related to drought issues in their community. So with these smallholder farmers, they've identified a solution to have irrigation using solar-powered water pump, which could also help grow their economic standing. Now, the Center for Global Equality was partnered with this community and identified some expertise that could potentially then address this issue locally. And so with the solar energy expertise hat on, I've been supporting from one side on the solar cell material that could be used within this community and working on the parameters and the site visits there. And there's also another whole team that's on power electronics using their expertise. But the most important part of this is that at the end, there's going to be we're looking at how to manufacture this locally and not just bringing the expertise over, but building partnerships and sharing that knowledge, and then really working with end users in order to deploy this type of technology in a regional level. So that's a story from outside of CCG, but what's relevant for the organization that I'm a part of. And then how do we apply that now with CCG, climate compatible growth? It's a different type of expertise, and it's a there's not just one demand coming in from a farmer in this case. There's many different demands. We have many different partner countries. So we take that inclusive innovation sort of nugget of idea, and we want to apply that to the different country contexts that we work in within the Climate Compatible Growth Program. So Kenya, Zambia, Laos, all of the different partner countries that we have. And then try and address that and use that inclusive innovation to then build up a network to kind of collect the demand that's coming in from the country and trying to match that expertise, but most importantly, sustain that expertise within our partner countries. I'll leave it there for now, but looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will come back to you to dig a little bit deeper into that example, which I think really does complement what Bernard raised about trying to unpack and put a face on what it is we're talking about. Over to you, Lucas.
Thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Lucas Somavilla. I work very closely with Professor Giacomo Lughetta on the Partnership Directorate side of the CCG program, where we sort of try to catalyze the demand for some of the things that we do at CCG, not just on the research side, but also try to really understand the needs of our developing country partners and strategize in ways in which we can build meaningful partnerships and deliver value for money for the Climate Compatible Growth Program. So I just want to start by thinking about the science. So I think it's really important for this conversation to think about the science policy interface. But let's start with the science for a moment. We have the IPCC reports who have been telling us about the risks and threats of climate change. But we're reaching a point where we've moved from higher levels of confidence that this is the case. So we're talking about a science that has been extremely robust and open and transparent and very thorough in the way that they have constructed the knowledge base to talk about climate change. Talking about 99% likelihood or virtually certain, you would say, that this is a global issue, right, that needs to be tackled urgently. But so how do we move from knowledge to action? And this is where I think I want to, from the angle where I would like to talk today, how do we translate the knowledge and the evidence that we've been producing over the years in a way that is relevant for policymakers, in a way that is translatable, in a way that is actionable? Because in a way, climate change is a collective collective action problem. But how do we move from the knowledge to how do we communicate this knowledge effectively and we move into action? We know the origins of climate change and as well as the historical responsibilities for emissions, but we need to find a way to build the right kind of partnerships and the right kind of strategies to deliver on the timely science that is telling us all the evidence, all the modeling, all the for both mitigation and adaptation. How do we basically move from knowledge to implementation?
Thank you. And all of you have raised some very important questions about, first of all, what do we mean by climate change? And Lucas, you've raised the question about how then do we then move from policy to action. I'm not going to ask Lakshmi to respond to this. I'll ask her first to give her opening remarks, and then I want us to come back and try to dig a little bit into the issues that you have all raised to hear the perspectives from across the panel. Over to you, Lakshmi.
Thank you.
maybe you want to increase the volume on this side?
Maybe we can ask Lakshmi to increase.
Or
Is it better now?
Much better, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me on this panel. My name is Lakshmi. I'm an advisor at UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center based in Denmark. And to briefly just mention that I've been working mostly in the area of energy transitions, solar PV across South Asia, but also in East Africa. I've also focused a lot on the political economy aspect of the transition and also how transnational actors and agency interacts with local agency at country levels, and also worked on supporting local SMEs in this energy productive use nexus. And just to very briefly mention broadly, our organization sits within UNEP and does science policy advisory work in the areas of energy, climate, and sustainable development. Mitigation, adaptation, transparency. We do have certain mandates as an executive agency as well for programs under UNEP and UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, which COP is part of as well. And we produce the annual emission gap reports and adaptation gap reports, and are supported also by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Denmark. And before we dive into the topic deeply, I also wanted to just as a point of departure as well, over and above what the other presenters have mentioned, speakers. I think just to put that point across, it's also important to still keep climate as part of a broader framing within environment, within sustainable development, especially in the African context that today we're going to be talking about. So I think that's just to kind of put that point across, that development is what the focus is. Development interventions are important, and how climate can actually, and climate research supports and is framed within the aspect of the development interventions, especially when we're talking about countries and contexts which are still working towards ensuring basic access to services, basic access to electricity, water, health and sanitation services, agriculture, food production, transport systems, you name it. So just to put that out there to get ourselves started as well, and then we'll take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we continue, I want to say to the people online, please feel free to raise questions in the chat as had been indicated earlier, so that you can all be part of the conversation as well. So, Bernard raised the question of we need to understand what climate change is so that we can target what we're saying to policymakers. Lakshmi says, well, if we're going to do it in the African context, let us put it in the context of development, in the broader development context. And and then you've also raised the point of how then do we then move, from the policy or from the knowledge to the action and so on. When it comes to the Africa context, what do our policymakers want? Because we're saying that the science, we have high confidence in the findings. They're not exactly very rosy. But what is it that policymakers would want from researchers for climate action? And how do we get that to them in a way that will inspire them to want to engage? Because we know the challenges of development and climate change are huge. So, who wants to go first?
Yeah, so as a way of maybe responding to that, there are two things that, I know there are many things, but I'll speak of two things that a policymaker wants, and particularly a policymaker who is inclined with the political system, maybe a politician who is a minister or a president. One, they need something that is timely. It is very important to give policy that is timely. But of course, that in itself brings in its own problems. How do you, for such a complex issue, how do you give a timely advice? Therefore, what do you need to set up for you to be able to give timely advice? But that's a discussion, or we might build on that idea later, right? But they want something that is timely, because they don't want to wait for long to be able to get the answer for a pressing issue that is happening right now. Then the other thing is, they want something that takes into consideration the political, social, the political economy context. most of the advice that the policymakers have lack that context. And it proves very difficult for them to trust that advice. You find maybe a professor from some university, some top university in the world, goes, talks to this politician, say, you have to do this. And the politician is wondering, does this professor or does this researcher actually understand what I'm going through?
But on that point, is that because we're talking about advice that is not homegrown, or what are the problems that are leading to that kind of resistance?
So two things. There's one, because advice is not homegrown, there is really, my experience with working with politicians is that they want someone they can trust, right? If something happens, this is someone I can trust that they did the work, or that I'm going to find them, right? Or they have skin in the game. But most of the advice that comes from outside, people who are advising don't have skin in the game, and it makes it very difficult for a politician to take that advice. They may pretend like they've taken it, but they may not really take it in principle, right? But the other one is, even if a solution is homegrown, if it doesn't take into consideration the political economy, it's not of use to a politician, a policymaker who has a political view to the system, because they know that at the end of the day, if that policy fails, the blame will be on them. So they have to ensure that, or as a policy analyst, you have to ensure that when you're advising policymakers, you need to take into consideration the country's context. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Pass on to the next.
Okay, I'll just reflect very briefly on that, because I think about that too, a lot, and I was wondering of which context. I know we're talking about developing world, but I think it also applies, what do they want in the North? It sometimes feels like, okay, they have all the evidence, and still there's lack of action. And so what does that mean, and what are some differences between the North and the South that can change that context a bit more? And I think the big one is data. One of the biggest differences is that there is a lack of access to data, or maybe data regulations and things like that. So having multiple stakeholders getting access to data, which I think is something that's changing, and be able to have dialogues and debate about the data, this kind of openness, and saying, well, we found evidence of this, but then have another party to refute that and say, okay, well, we have other data that has evidence, and so you start having this further dialogue across for policymakers to then see, okay, there's some arguments here. I can take multiple of these arguments and reflect upon this, and rather than just having a single stakeholder, and that helps boost transparency, which I guess is the other part, is just making sure that the advice is given is transparent and backed up with data. Thanks.
Okay, maybe we take Lakshmi, and then we can come to you, Lucas.
Sure. I agree with what also Beth mentioned, and it's also, we tend to pool a lot under policy. There are many different sets of needs, from very precise data, whether it's precise business case for certain technological choices that they're making, whether it's specific kind of regulatory interventions that could trigger a certain market, whether it's capacities of certain kinds at the governance level, whether it's certain kind of financing options that are available for X interventions. So I think the needs are very varied depending on the context and depending on who the taker is. But the two sets of problems with current practices, also building on what Bernard and others mentioned, is that one, that it's the research that's happening may not always be very well aligned with the needs and priorities of the countries. And second, that research is sometimes operating independently of the policy purview or in parallel with limited direct interaction. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much. Lucas?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to build this great panel, and you're having really interesting insights. Yes, I mean, when it comes to context really matters, right? So there is no one size fits all, especially, I mean, even when you have the evidence, how do you deconstruct that evidence and trickle down it to the local context? And of course, in the context of policy making and decision making, sometimes decisions need to be made urgently, and there might not be available data or available evidence to back up those decisions, but decisions still need to be made. And this puts a lot of constraints in terms of how do you, as a researcher, as a policy practitioner, understand the tension between the knowledge and the action in terms of the need for the timely evidence that needs to be provided at the right time for those decisions to be made in a way that is timely, in a way that is digestible, in a way that is transparent, but also there is the other component where let's not forget about politics here. Politics is extremely important, and we see with the climate negotiations and even today at the global stocktake, we're lacking on finance, and this is, the tyranny of finance is what what decision makers always think about in the end, because even if you have the solutions, even if you have the data, implementing those solutions, whether those are technology solutions, whether there's natural-based solutions, you still need to count and have the money, and mobilizing that money is what ultimately is going to influence that decision-making process.
Thank you. Two things that I picked from some of the remarks here. One, politicians want timely information, and we know politicians also operate on a shorter, should I say, time horizon than the kind of solutions we're seeking in the context of climate change. How do you reconcile those? Because also research is not something you do overnight. So how do you reconcile the temporal aspect of trying to bridge the gap between getting the research to inform policy? I don't know who wants to take that first. Lakshmi, should I start with you?
It's a good question. I guess partly it's to do with foresight. I think we try to we do a lot of modeling, we try to attempt to stay ahead of the time by building these longitudinal time horizon based studies to already anticipate what's coming so that we have enough. But we also know that climate, we've been also not paying attention to a lot of the signals for a long time now, and the timeline is also shrinking. However, I still feel that, there is also risk in rushing decisions and implementations in the name of urgency as well. So I think there's always going to be that dichotomy that we want quick implementation, but at the same time we want them to be thought through. We want them to be better informed. We want equity and distributional justice to be taken care of as well. And we want, and engaging with local context doesn't necessarily mean speaking to a couple of stakeholders. It does actually mean engaging with the socio-political histories of that place, of the land use, of the resource use. So I don't really have a clear answer as to how do we shrink all of that and provide these, which is now a trend. We are providing more and more bite-sized so-called policy briefs. Mm-hmm. But we are also running into the risk of over-synthesizing and perhaps reducing and simplifying narratives at times. Thanks.
Okay. Any other views?
And then that creates a very interesting situation for Africa, right? I guess when you look at developing countries, most of them don't have research institutes that have got money to spend on developing models and anticipating certain decisions that are to come. Though they are well placed to interact with the local systems. Mm-hmm. Like I used to work for an institution called ZIPA in Zambia, Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research. The more you interact with the people in the government systems or in the policy process, you can kind of pick up what might come. At least you will have a fairly good idea of what might come, right? But the problem is, you need, each activity that you're going to do, you need a budget line for it. And most institutions or research institutions in Africa don't have that much money to be able to spend on those anticipated future requests from the government or from the politician. Therefore, it makes it very difficult to kind of provide the timely advice. And if there's one thing that I would recommend that we think of doing, would be how can we raise money for researchers in developing countries to be able to spend their precious time on some of those activities that they sense or they feel or they can predict that might come. In the current standing, at least from the Zambian context, and I know it's obtaining in many countries, we don't have that much money to just keep working on this project or this problem without actually an end, what one would call demand-driven, right? But the time is, if demand is there, then you're already late, because the problem is very complicated and you need a lot of time for you to be able to provide good evidence or good advice. So the issue of needing to raise money for developing countries, researchers or developing country advisors or research institutions to be able to spend a bit more time on future issues that they think that might arise would be of value compared to what is currently obtaining.
So in the last 2 decades, maybe even 3 decades, without revealing my age, since some of us were in university, we've seen how the research capacity on the continent has grown. But despite that, we're still seeing policies that tend to be short-sighted and not as effective. What is really the reason why we are not being able to harness that capacity? Is it misplaced? Are we working on issues that are not, as you were saying, aligned with what could inform our potential? Or is it the funding issue? What is that critical thing that is stopping us from unlocking the full potential of the research capacity that has been growing, even though slowly, but has been growing on the continent? And the second question is then, what do we need to do to then start defining that research policy practice interface? So maybe I will start with Lucas, and then we go to Beth, and then come round again.
Thank you very much. That's a really good question. I think one of the issues when you think about this short-sight kind of policy is the fact that knowledge sometimes doesn't get institutionalized in the way that it should. So there is no process. There's no process in place, no mechanism, no governance framework for dealing with the evidence in a way that is constructive for, through a dedicated institutionalized process that helps inform those policies in the first place. So, in a way, we're confronted in many cases with the lack of particular expert bodies that are dedicated, where you have expertise, in-country expertise that understand the needs of the country, the context, but is able to, experts that are able to digest the evidence that is coming out there globally, and put it, translate it to the national context, and be able to do so in a way in which is legitimate, in a way that is credible, and that is salient for those people making decisions. So I think maybe one of the areas that is worth thinking about is this conversation around capacity building. There is a lot of going on for a long time, and this is all school development programs and projects always talk about the need for capacity building. But the question is, how do you retain that capacity in country? How do you build the ownership in country so that those experts that get trained are actually better equipped, but also with a specific mandate and mission to transfer that knowledge in the country. So that when those projects and programs end, they don't go elsewhere, but they stayed and help build that knowledge base that the African countries need, for example.
Yeah, so I agree completely, and I want to build upon some of those ideas you were coming out with, Lucas. So I think there's not just one reason why it hasn't grown as necessarily as fast, the capacity, as one would want. I mean, there's lack of finance for research, which, you know, what that points to from my point of view is the infrastructure for financing is either diverted elsewhere. Research is maybe seen as some sort of luxury, or there's a lack of ownership and lack of really truly seeing the value that research could bring to the country as a whole. So I think one of the things, and I'll use CCG as an example, is trying to address this within the national partnerships team within CCG. What we're trying to do is build this network of people who have capacity already, but also see a lot of value in continuing to build and embed that and institutionalize, like Lucas said, that knowledge, and keep going, seeing these champions within the country that want to build something and see that sustained and throughout, but also what that needs critically, not only these champions for research, but you need the government to really see the value in having that and that ownership, and being able, almost seeing some sense of pride in having that expertise and people that they can call upon for research to say, look, this is homegrown, this is definitely demand led. And I think trying to build that, what we call community of practice, because once you start seeing the value that certain projects can bring, particularly when they're from the country and developed within that country, and seeing the community that those bring, and then extending that practice outward, making sure you see that those work later on, and that expertise being leveraged for other decision making. And I think that even slightly comes back to the timing. You know, that dialogue is constant. So when you start having that dialogue, you can kind of tell where the next step will be, and then, you know, it would expand upon. So yeah, those are just a few thoughts. Thanks.
I want to talk about trust.
I was going to come to that next, but go ahead.
I want to talk about trust. You know, when a foreign consultant, for example, goes to a country, they generally have money. Right? And much of the times, the money that they spend outside the country for the work, the money that they spend in a particular country, say country X, for the work that they're doing in that country, is way less than the money they spend in country Y, which is the home country. And if you're a politician, or if you're a policymaker, or at least I worked with them, there's always that thing that remains in their head to say, is this person doing this because they're really convicted in what they're doing? Or they are doing it because they have the money, or there is money on the table, and they're doing it. And then if you're a politician, you ask yourself, if I'm to do this, if I'm to implement the recommendation that this person has put forward, what confidence do I have that it's going to work? And on any day, a politician will go with their guts, right? Because they know that at the end of the day, the blame will be on them and not necessarily on the consultant that has come in. So if we can create institutions within the country and finance the institutions from within the country, of course, there are collaborations that needs to be developed because of issues to do with skills and skills gaps and just knowledge sharing and knowledge transfer. But if we are able to develop institutions, strong institutions within the country, where if a politician makes a decision based on my recommendation, say I'm in the energy sector, and the politician gets it wrong, the politician and myself will actually suffer together. Whereas if a politician makes a decision based on person who is living in country Y, and the politician is in X, something blows up in country X, the person who is living in country Y is free.
I definitely agree with you. I mean, trust is big, and I wanted to talk a little bit about trust in the context of partnership, but you have raised the question here that I want to put on the table, because quite often we hear about the politician making the decision. And I want to talk about the governance of the policy decisions, because this is where I think we need to start thinking less of individuals deciding on behalf of masses, but building capacities around those institutions within which these individuals reside, so they can, do their duties. So my thing here, and the reason I want to raise this, and maybe I'll turn to Lakshmi for this question, is, do we have some good examples from the Global South where we have good governance of policy process that integrate research, whether they're doing their own or whether they're drawing it from academia? And if they're there, what can we do to be able to elevate those, to be able to start pushing a process of inclusive, representative, democratic decision-making that is well-informed and that is not sensationalist and does not sell, the image of we're all going to hell, but rather sells the image that, not even the image, sells the reality that we have opportunities at hand. So do we have those examples? And if we do, why are we not leveraging them? So let me start with you, Lakshmi.
Sure. I think we do. We do have examples, maybe not always known, not always clear how they have come about, but just to give one small example from, say, Uganda, and which the Ugandan Electricity Authority, the head of it, who drove the entire, what we call as the policy transfer process around auctions, around what was later called as Get Fit program, to support renewable energy projects in Uganda. And it happened through a very interesting process. I mean, the way we, in a more classic sense, understand policy transfer, the way Germany developed the policies and then it's transferred in the Ugandan context. But in this case, the head of ERA actually took a very strong ownership role, did engage with the examples and how the FIT as well as auction policies were being implemented across different contexts, but also held the ground, held that local agency while engaging with international researchers, with international experts throughout the entire process of implementation. And also, the best part which they did was institutionalizing, which is what we're all talking about. There was an immense, rigorous training that the mid-level managers within the Electricity Regulatory Authority went through during that process. That still remains. Now the heads have changed. Multiple heads have changed. But those middle managers still exist within the institution. We've worked with some of them, both in Kenya as well as in Uganda. We're still in touch with some of them who sometimes want to do a PhD or sometimes have their own research aspirations. And we also see in the Uganda context, for instance, they've just also come up with a cooking tariff around in order to tackle the charcoal issue. That's coming from this institution. A lot of that research, a lot of a very deep insight into what kind of tariffs and incentives would work. That's not coming entirely from outside. And sometimes you would say, okay, what's the linkage here with, say, a program like MEX? Do they know about it? What were the linkages? So I do feel that there are good examples, and the fact that, and just to drill that point again, that it is important to invest in the science policy research capacity at the country level. It is absolutely, absolutely important to create budget, public expenditure for that, to recognize science policy research as an important lever of development, to strengthen academic institutions, to strengthen R&D capacities. And I think it's also an onus on government authorities at times to both value but create space for research as well. And I think those linkages are weak in some contexts still. But we do see, I mean, we have seen good outcomes of the climate innovation centers, for instance, in 6, 7 different countries. We also see how Strathmore Energy Research Center is working. We've seen how well-connected Carnegie Mellon Rwanda has been in producing this new batch of, very dynamic youth that are going ahead with new startups. We've seen proactive education support in Sierra Leone by the minister, David Senge. So, and also in Zambia, the National Institute of Scientific and Industrial Research. I mean, and they're all doing good work, but as we said, I mean, we really need to strengthen these institutions further. We need to provide them with a lot more finance and expenditure and bring them closer to policy implementation and government.
Thanks. I want to come back to a point. I think that's an extremely important point, that we have good examples, we need to elevate them, we need to learn from them to inform how we strengthen our institutions, and of course making sure that we are strengthening institutions that could be sustained over the longer term. I want to come to a point that Bernard raised at the beginning, which was about unpacking the climate issue and understanding it from the different level of interventions that you would be expecting. Now, if climate change is a systemic challenge, how can we target sector policymakers when the challenge is much broader and interconnected? So how do we navigate that matrix that we have to within the government institutional system with all the different stakeholders? You have 30 seconds to solve all our problems in that way.
Sure, I'll give that a shot. So I think that would require not only interdisciplinary research and seeing the value of that, but also it would require interministerial working together. So, for example, say you have a network that has different areas of expertise, such as the CCG program, or something like this. It's trying to foster not only certain parts of energy and transport, but how that relates to policy as well. So let's say that then transport relates to emissions, which also needs to be calculated by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, and you're working with Ministry of Transport, and you're working with Ministry of Energy, because if you want EVs to come online, you need energy. So even within one kind of simplistic special interest group, for example, you would need to have this cross-ministerial dialogue, cross-research dialogue, and then start normalizing that practice and seeing the value of, shared content across these different ministries and, stakeholders in general within academia and different diverse academia perspectives. Thanks.
Okay.
Lucas, can I elaborate on that? Thank you, Beth. I think that's a really good point, actually. We're talking about the science policy interface and the process of communicating and engaging with the decision makers, and these things takes time, and also the fact that policy in many contexts happens in silos. So when you talk about energy policy, we talk about digitalization, these things don't necessarily connected, right? I mean, they are connected, but they're connected in the science. Increasingly there is evidence that intersectoral sector interactions are a really important topic. But then how do we build and communicate that to those decision makers that are in fact operating in silos? It's a very kind of first step, I would say. And then through that process, through that institutionalization process of the knowledge, you have to. It takes time, and you have to bring those different stakeholders on the table over and over again in order to feed these different perspectives into the discussion, so that a minister or a government official who is working on energy understands the interlinkages between energy and digitalization, for instance. Even further, across the nexus, the energy, water, and food nexus, it's an increasingly important issue. And the fact is that we don't have, in many cases, the mechanisms to do so. So that's something perhaps to think about in terms of generating partnerships that are dedicated to bridge the gap between these different sectors, not just in the research space, but also in communicating the evidence to the decision makers.
Okay, and Lakshmi?
Yeah, just to supplement, I think in the research space, we are a bit ahead on that. We are already talking about cross-sectoral synergies and trade-offs, but unfortunately, at least from our experience of working with a number of countries in the governance space, it's still extremely political, it's still very siloed, and we, through many programs within our own center, whether it's the technology needs assessment or even the ICAT transparency work, we work across many different line ministries. And even if we have similar programs, sometimes we're working with 2 different line ministries because there is territoriality, because there is politics, because there are mandates that they have to follow within their own countries and their own reporting requirements as well. That is a big challenge. We haven't been able to still now, even working very closely with some of the ministries, with NDEs, with country coordinators, have not really been able to go around.
Thank you. I have a number of questions that have come from the online audience that speak to how we basically reconcile the introduction of new technologies such as carbon capture with the business as usual practices, and how do we then bring in cutting-edge research to start changing policies, especially when these are things that are not exactly part of the mainstream. What are your thoughts in terms of trying to bring more innovative thinking, whether it is regards to using carbon captured based batteries, I think that's what it's called, carbon dioxide efficient batteries, or whether we are trying to change, should I say, land use practices to bring in more climate smart ag, while at the same time we have certain trade deals that, have occupied our land to feed other populations. So how do we change established practices to be able to introduce innovative cutting edge practices and technologies? Absolutely.
Well, I think I don't know how we can do that, but at least I know what needs to happen for it to work. For that to work, I think the incentives have to be properly allocated. Most times, technologies that are presented seem to be extractive in nature, and people are always skeptical. So if at all innovative solutions have to be adopted or diffused to be normal practice, the incentives have to be such that the country which will host those technologies will benefit. And much of the time, like we were talking just the previous question on interdisciplinary natures of research, the people who advise policymakers are people just like me and you. And most of the time, a policymaker will listen to a person they see, whether it's in the system, a well-structured governance system, or it's an individual level. The issue of who am I seeing, who is telling me this, matters. If a product is very innovative and no one understands it in the country, there is no system that is going to adopt that. And in part, it's because you're always skeptical about the incentives. And I'm speaking as an African, where we've seen people promise X and never deliver on it. That just makes it very difficult. If someone tells you, oh, this technology can solve all your problems, and there is no researcher within the country, or there is no research institute within the country who can actually back up that. If I'm the policy maker or I'm the policy advisor making the call, I'm asked, I'll say, well, this is very risky, right?
So is there an issue that we need to democratize evidence to practice process, which basically comes into conflict with the top-down nature of governance?
Yes, but actually I'm talking about not necessarily the governance, but the people who are feeding into the governance structure, right? who drives them? Now, this is a skepticism of an African, right? And I've worked both in Europe and I've worked in developing countries, that's in sub-Saharan Africa. There is that issue where, yes, we can say the politicians are not doing their part or the government is not doing their part. But then the alternative question is that who is advising the government to do the part that you're saying they're not doing?
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question because I know we're about to run out of time, and then I'm going to ask you guys to give us the golden, the solution to the situation. We've talked a lot about the politicians, the policymakers, the researchers. When it comes to the practice, when we're translating the policies into the real actions, society comes into play. And we haven't talked about how we get research findings to inform societal choices, which I assume is the basis on which also politicians react, because they need their votes anyway. So I would like your reflections on that part of this nexus, the practice element, especially as it relates to the broader society. So I will start with Lakshmi, and we'll come round through Lucas, Beth, and then Bernard.
I think just to link your previous question as well as this question, right? We are talking about technological solutions to, again, help society. And just bringing that point again of the whole systems approach and looking at it in holistic ways. So we can talk about, in the innovation aspect, we see growing focus on e-mobility and electric vehicles as an alternative in the African context, for instance. But which is a better alternative for sure, but would they work if the approach to urban planning remains still the same? If the transport systems are still conventionally designed, if the road infrastructure still remains the way we are witnessing right now, if the governance around it remains the same, no, it won't. It won't help with access to mobility. It won't help with the number of road accidents that we witness. It won't help with congestion. It won't help with women's mobility and safety. And it does boil down to these intersections and these, link to practice when we say that ultimately a lot of the work that's going on is to be able to solve some of these problems or to be able to address them and link with practical solutions, which are not just about piecemeal technological solutions, but about engaging with the context, thinking about the end user as well, even when we talk about our research. Who is this for? Who wants this? What change is it supposed to bring? And are the actions and outputs designed in accordance to that? Because the weak link still, which we are all pointing to constantly, is this translation from outputs to outcomes, right? What is the takeoff of it? So I do want to just leave with those points that we really do want. I think all of us, everybody needs to invest more time into scoping, scanning, identifying needs, engaging early on from project design stage, and not just with the ministries, but across different levels of the government as well as think tanks and academia. And cannot avoid the inherent power dynamics, which is what Bernard also brings, this whole point of trust, which is extremely essential in the whole process. Maybe I'm just trying to ram in too many points at the very end, so I'll just pass it on to other speakers. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to give 20 seconds to each one of you.
Thank you. I think we've also, we don't have to forget the role of the private sector, because when it comes to technological innovation and R&D, now we're talking about governance, right? Governance in the wider sense also involves all the stakeholders. And when we think about the development and deploying and diffusion of technologies, both for mitigation and adaptation, as you mentioned, carbon capture, storage, we also need to think about it from a responsible perspective, right? How do we address the kind of societal challenges, environmental challenges in a way that is participatory, yes, but also with the right kind of frameworks to assess risks and uncertainties surrounding those technological development, especially when they are driven by economic interest from private sector that might not be in the best legitimate interest of those nations.
Okay, so I think it comes down to a few things because your two questions at the end here are quite related. So if we're trying to bring in new technologies, we have what that necessarily says is who asked for that? Did the country ask for that, or what stakeholders are involved here? And so you can't necessarily even translate that into the context of the end user because maybe the country didn't even ask for that in the first place. So to say that the science, unless the science is calling for that from the country, and so if that's the case, say that the technology and the innovation is coming from the researchers within the country context, or there's a demand for that, then it's about how to quantify and also look at the winners and losers of that technology from the country's perspective, because ultimately those are the end users who will be the voters of the politicians who will then say, so if you put your research in the context of the people, along with the different technologies and how it will improve lives or improve climate, I think that'll be the key. That's it.
And Bernard, do you have the last word?
Yeah, mine is inclusive. On top of everything that has been said, how do you include people in the process of making the decision? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this has been really insightful, and Africa has a lot of opportunity. I remember when I started working on climate change, we all were talking about this like it was going to be the end of the world. But as we look at what research is telling us about the solutions that we need to be developing, and solutions that can also help advance development, a lot of these are in the African context. But of course, we should not lose sight of the fact that we are dealing with a crisis. My take on life is always that you need to get the information and the knowledge to get people sufficiently concerned about the problem, but yet be inspired to act, and not get them so terrified that they get paralyzed. So there is a clear role for objective, sound research to inform decisions that our politicians can take, our policymakers can take, that our society can take, that will change those practices and not only put Africa on a climate resilient path, but also on a path to prosperity. So thank you very much. We're counting on all of you to work with your peers through all forms of partnerships to ensure the inclusive work, to ensure ownership and relevance, to ensure that there is trust, and then, of course, as a global community, working together to make sure that the resources are available to make all of this happen. So thank you very much for today.